Snow was falling hard over the Ardennes when everything began to fall apart. German tanks were moving through frozen forests, engines roaring in the cold, believing they had one final chance to change the war. American soldiers were surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered. Supplies were running low. Roads were blocked. And for a moment, it looked like Germany's last gamble might actually work. But what happened in the next 48 hours would seal Germany's fate forever. This is the story of encirclement, desperation, speed, and a counterstrike that changed history. You're watching History Plus, and today we're stepping inside one of the most intense turning points of World War II. Before we go deeper, make sure you like this video and subscribe to History Plus. It helps this channel grow and allows us to bring you more powerful stories told with clarity and detail. Now let's step into December 1944. By late 1944, many believed the war in Europe was almost over. Allied forces had pushed across France after D-Day. German forces were retreating, cities were falling, supplies were stretched thin, morale inside Germany was weakening. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. He believed one massive counterattack in the West could split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a political settlement. It was a bold idea, risky and desperate, but to Hitler it was the only remaining option. The plan was simple in theory. German forces would strike through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed was too difficult for a large attack. Snow-covered roads and thick woods gave a false sense of security. American divisions stationed there were exhausted and underprepared for a major assault. In the early morning darkness of December 16, 1944, German artillery exploded across the front. Thousands of shells crashed into American lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. At first, confusion spread quickly. Communication lines were cut. Units were separated. German armored columns punched through weak points, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front line. Roads became choke points. Refugees and military vehicles mixed together. Reports coming in were unclear and sometimes contradictory. Was this a small attack or something much larger? Within hours, it became clear this was a full-scale offensive. One of the most critical locations in this region was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. It did not look important on a map at first glance, but 7 major roads passed through it. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement in the entire sector. German commanders understood this. So did the Americans. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed into Bastogne with little preparation. Many soldiers arrived without full winter gear. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow covered the ground. Ammunition and medical supplies were limited. Yet the order was clear. Hold the town at all costs. Within days, German forces surrounded Bastogne. The Americans were encircled. Artillery pounded the town day and night. Trees shattered from explosions. Buildings collapsed. Wounded soldiers filled makeshift aid stations. Food was rationed carefully. There were moments when it seemed impossible to survive, let alone win. German commanders believed surrender was only a matter of time. They sent a message demanding that the Americans give up to avoid complete destruction. The reply from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was short and unforgettable. Nuts. It was not just a word. It was a signal of defiance. Bastogne would not fall easily. While Bastogne held, something important was happening beyond the snow-covered woods. Allied High Command began to understand the scale of the threat. This was not a minor push. It was Germany's final large offensive in the West. If it succeeded, the war could drag on much longer. Quick decisions were required. General George S. Patton and his Third Army were positioned further south, moving east toward Germany. When news of the German breakthrough reached him, Patton did something few believed possible. Instead of continuing east, he pivoted his entire army north toward Bastogne. In winter conditions, on icy roads, under constant pressure, it was one of the fastest large-scale maneuver changes of the war. But speed alone was not enough. The weather had grounded Allied aircraft for days. Heavy fog and snow protected German movements from air attacks. German tanks advanced deeper into the Bulge. Fuel shortages were already becoming a concern for them, but at this stage, momentum was still on their side. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew worse before it improved. Artillery strikes intensified. German infantry probed defensive lines. American soldiers dug foxholes into frozen ground. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Medics worked without rest. Yet morale did not collapse. Small victories, holding a crossroad, stopping a tank, pushing back a patrol, kept hope alive. The German high command began to feel pressure as well. Their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Fuel reserves were lower than planned. Bridges were damaged. Traffic jams formed along narrow forest roads. What had started as a powerful breakthrough was now facing logistical strain. Then something changed. The weather cleared. Blue sky broke through the clouds. Allied aircraft roared back into action. Fighter bombers attacked German columns stuck on icy roads. Supply trucks exploded. Bridges were destroyed. Airdrops delivered food, ammunition, and medical supplies into Bastogne. For the first time in days, the surrounded defenders felt relief. Patton's forces were closing in, but the next 48 hours would determine everything. If German forces could crush Bastogne before full relief arrived, they might still regain momentum. If the Americans could hold just a little longer, the entire offensive could collapse. Snow continued to fall lightly across the battlefield as armored units advanced toward each other. Tanks moved carefully through narrow forest roads. Infantry followed close behind. Every mile mattered, every hour mattered. The encirclement was about to turn into something else. The question was no longer whether Bastogne would fall. The question was whether Germany's final gamble was about to fail. And in the next part, we will step directly into those critical 48 hours that transformed encirclement into escape and sealed Germany's fate once and for all. The air felt different when the weather cleared. After days of snow and heavy fog, blue sky opened above the frozen forests of the Ardennes. That single change shifted the balance of power almost instantly. German armored columns that had moved under cloud cover were now exposed. Allied aircraft roared overhead, diving toward narrow roads packed with tanks, fuel trucks, and infantry transports. Explosions echoed through the woods. What had once looked like unstoppable momentum was suddenly fragile. Inside Bastogne, American soldiers heard the distant sound of engines above them, and for the first time in days, hope felt real. German commanders knew time was slipping away. Their entire plan depended on speed. The offensive had to move fast, seize key bridges, and push toward Antwerp before the Allies reorganized. But speed requires fuel, coordination, and open roads. By this point, fuel shortages were no longer a minor problem. Some German tanks were already abandoned because they simply ran dry. Others waited in long lines, engines idling, hoping for supply trucks that were themselves under attack from the air. The Ardennes roads were narrow and winding. One destroyed. Vehicle could block an entire column for hours. Every delay meant the Allies grew stronger. Inside Bastogne, the defenders were still under heavy pressure. German artillery continued to pound the town. Infantry assaults probed weak points in the perimeter. American units rotated positions constantly to prevent collapse in any single sector. Ammunition had to be used carefully. Medics treated wounded, men in freezing cellars and damaged buildings. Yet something had changed in the mindset of the defenders. They were no longer just surviving. They were holding for relief that was now clearly coming. General Patton's Third Army was pushing north with remarkable speed. Roads were icy and dangerous. Engineers worked non-stop clearing debris and repairing bridges. Supply officers calculated fuel consumption down to the smallest detail. Tanks, half-tracks, and trucks stretched for miles. It was not an easy march. German resistance stiffened as they realized what was happening. Units that had been moving west were suddenly ordered to turn and defend against Patton's approach. Confusion increased. Communication broke down in places. Orders arrived late or conflicted with reality on the ground. For German leadership, frustration began to replace confidence. The offensive had started with surprise and power. Now it was facing resistance, air superiority, and tightening Allied coordination. Hitler insisted the attack continue. He believed that hesitation would guarantee defeat. But many German officers understood the truth. The window of opportunity was closing fast. On the ground, the fighting intensified as American armored units approached Bastogne's outer perimeter. Snow-covered fields became battlegrounds. Tanks fired across open spaces, shells cutting through trees and sending splinters into the air. Infantry advanced cautiously behind armored support. Every village became a contested point. German anti-tank positions waited in ambush along tree lines. Losses mounted on both sides. This was no simple breakthrough. It was a brutal, grinding fight for every mile. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, American forces launched limited counterattacks to keep German units off balance. They could not afford to remain passive. Small patrols pushed out at night, gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy positions. Artillery observers adjusted fire with precision, targeting supply routes and staging areas. Even surrounded, they remained aggressive. That aggression slowed German efforts to fully concentrate against Patton's incoming forces. The psychological dimension of the battle became just as important as the physical one. German soldiers who had believed they were driving deep into Allied territory now saw aircraft dominating the sky and heard reports of American reinforcements arriving from multiple directions. Rumors spread quickly in cold trenches. Was the offensive failing? Were they being counter-encircled? Uncertainty weakens momentum, and momentum had been the foundation of the entire operation. As the 48-hour window narrowed, the fighting reached a decisive moment. Patton's lead elements made contact with German defensive lines blocking access to Bastogne. The clash was intense. Artillery thundered from both sides. Tanks maneuvered carefully, searching for weak spots. American commanders understood that even a small corridor into Bastogne would change everything. It did not need to be wide at first. It only needed to exist. Weather conditions remained cold but clear, allowing continued air support. Allied fighter bombers struck deeper behind German lines, targeting fuel depots and command posts. Supply shortages grew worse. Some German units began conserving ammunition. Others repositioned defensively, abandoning hopes of pushing further west. The offensive spirit that had launched the attack was fading. Inside Bastogne, soldiers watched the horizon carefully. Every explosion in the distance could signal approaching relief or another enemy assault. Morale was fragile but determined. They had held through bombardment, hunger, cold, and constant threat. Now they were waiting for the final breakthrough. Then it happened. American armored units broke through German lines south of Bastogne and reached the outskirts of the town. The corridor was narrow and dangerous, but it was open. The encirclement was cracked. Trucks began moving through cautiously, bringing additional supplies and evacuating wounded soldiers. It was not the end of fighting, but it was the end of isolation. The relief of Bastogne sent shockwaves through both sides. For the Americans, it proved that coordination, speed, and resilience could overcome even the harshest winter battlefield. For the Germans, it marked a turning point. The offensive that had once seemed bold and powerful was now stalled and vulnerable. But the story was not over yet. The next phase would determine whether Germany could stabilize the front or whether this failed gamble would accelerate the collapse of their entire western position. The 48 hours had shifted the balance, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. In the next part, we will see how this failed offensive reshaped the war in Europe and why historians often say this was the moment Germany's fate was sealed for good. The moment the corridor into Bastogne opened, the entire dynamic of the battlefield changed. What had once been a desperate pocket of resistance was now connected to the larger Allied force. Supplies began moving in with greater consistency. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. Fresh units rotated into defensive positions. The town was still under threat, but it was no longer alone. That single connection broke the psychological pressure that had defined the siege. For German forces, however, the situation grew increasingly unstable. Their offensive had depended on speed, surprise, and uninterrupted momentum. Now they faced reinforced American lines, constant air attacks, and supply shortages that could no longer be ignored. Fuel was critically low in many armored divisions. Some tanks were used as stationary artillery because they could not risk wasting the last drops in their fuel tanks. Infantry units were exhausted from days of continuous fighting in freezing conditions. German commanders attempted to reorganize. Orders were issued to consolidate positions and prepare for defensive operations. But reorganizing during active combat is never simple. Roads were damaged, communications were unreliable, units were scattered across wooded terrain. Coordination suffered. The bold arrows that had once pushed westward on planning maps were now bending backward under pressure. Allied forces did not waste the opportunity. Reinforcements arrived not only from Patton's Third Army in the south, but also from units. Strengthening the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the goal was clear: compress the German penetration from both sides and eliminate the threat entirely. American artillery began operating with greater efficiency, targeting German strongpoints and retreat routes. Air superiority ensured that any large movement risked immediate attack from above. Inside Bastogne, morale improved dramatically. Soldiers who had endured isolation now saw the larger strategy unfolding around them. Their stand had bought time. That time allowed the Allies to regroup and respond with strength. The defenders were no longer just holding ground. They were part of a coordinated counteroffensive. Confidence grew, and with it came renewed aggression. Meanwhile, the broader German strategic picture looked increasingly grim. The offensive had consumed valuable reserves, men, tanks, fuel, that Germany could not easily replace. Losses in experienced crews were particularly damaging. Every destroyed tank represented not just lost equipment, but trained soldiers who could not be quickly substituted. As Allied attacks intensified, the strain became unbearable in certain sectors. Weather conditions, once a protective shield for German movement, now worked against them. Clear skies meant constant reconnaissance. Allied pilots reported positions, identified traffic jams, and directed strikes with precision. Bridges that had been captured or constructed in haste were destroyed. Supply lines fractured further. What had started as an offensive now required defensive reactions at nearly every turn. German soldiers on the ground began sensing the shift. Instead of pushing forward confidently, they were digging in, bracing for counterattacks. The psychological impact of losing momentum cannot be overstated. Armies built on aggressive action often struggle when forced into retreat. Rumors spread. Some units questioned whether the offensive objectives were still achievable. Others simply focused on survival. American commanders recognized the importance of speed. They understood that hesitation could allow German forces to stabilize, so pressure remained constant. Coordinated attacks squeezed the Bulge from north and south. Each mile retaken reduced the area under German control. Each reclaimed town restored Allied supply routes and communications. Gradually, the massive bulge in the front line began shrinking. For Adolf Hitler, the reality was difficult to accept. He had envisioned the Ardennes offensive as a decisive strike that would fracture Allied unity. Instead, it had drained Germany's remaining offensive strength. His insistence on continuing the attack in its early stages had cost time and resources that could not be recovered. By the end of December, even optimistic projections could not hide the truth. The gamble had failed. As January approached, German forces were increasingly ordered to withdraw to more defensible positions. The retreat was dangerous. Allied aircraft attacked exposed columns. Artillery harassed movement. Snow-covered roads that had once supported the advance now slowed the withdrawal. Equipment was abandoned when fuel ran out. What remained of the offensive spirit was replaced by exhaustion. For the Allies, the victory at Bastogne became symbolic. It demonstrated resilience under extreme pressure. It proved that rapid operational shifts, like Patton's pivot north, could alter the course of an entire campaign. Most importantly, it showed that Germany no longer possessed the capacity to launch a sustained, large-scale offensive in the West. But the deeper consequence was strategic. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last major attempt to regain initiative on the Western Front. After its failure, the balance of power became irreversible. Allied forces retained air superiority, industrial advantage, and growing manpower. Germany's resources were shrinking on all fronts. west against the Americans and British, east against the advancing Soviet forces. The relief of Bastogne was not just a tactical success. It marked the beginning of the end of Germany's ability to control events in the West. The next phase of the war would be driven by Allied momentum, not German ambition. And in the final part, we will examine how this collapse accelerated the final push into Germany itself, and why historians say those 48 hours truly sealed Germany's fate. By early January 1945, the shape of the battlefield told the full story. The bulge that had once pushed deep into Allied lines was shrinking rapidly. What had started as Germany's bold winter gamble was now collapsing under relentless pressure. American and British forces tightened their grip from both north and south. The German advance had stalled, reversed, and was now retreating through the same snow-covered forests it had once stormed through with confidence. The cost of the offensive was enormous. Germany had committed some of its best remaining armored divisions. Tanks, artillery, trucks, and experienced crews were lost in large numbers. Fuel reserves that were already scarce had been burned in a gamble that failed to deliver results. The damage could not be replaced quickly, if at all. From this point forward, Germany would fight mostly on the defensive in the West. For the soldiers who fought in and around Bastogne, the relief was more than strategic, it was personal. They had endured freezing temperatures, constant shelling, hunger, and isolation. They had watched friends fall beside them. They had defended crossroads, woods, and shattered buildings with determination that surprised even their enemies. When the corridor opened and the siege was broken, it proved that resilience under pressure could change the course of history. General Patton's rapid maneuver became one of the most studied operational movements of the war. Military historians often point to those 48 hours as a masterclass in adaptability and speed. Turning an entire army in winter conditions, coordinating logistics, and launching a counterattack under pressure required discipline and bold leadership. But it also required something less visible, confidence that the risk would succeed. On the German side, the failure of the Ardennes offensive carried deeper consequences than just lost territory. It destroyed the last realistic hope of forcing a negotiated peace in the West. The Allies now understood clearly that Germany's offensive strength was broken. From this point forward, the road into Germany itself would open wider with each passing week. As Allied forces advanced eastward after the battle, momentum never truly returned to German hands. Bridges across the Rhine would eventually fall. Cities would be surrounded, industrial centers would be bombed relentlessly. The collapse that began in the snow of the Ardennes accelerated through the spring of 1945. What happened during those critical 48 hours did not end the war instantly, but it removed Germany's final chance to control its outcome. The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by American forces in World War II. But within that massive campaign, the relief of Bastogne stands out as the defining moment. Encirclement turned into escape. Desperation turned into determination. A gamble turned into irreversible decline. When historians analyze turning points in war, they often look for moments where momentum shifts permanently. Those winter days in December 1944 were exactly that kind of moment. Germany's final offensive in the West did not just fail, it exhausted the very strength needed to continue fighting on equal terms. After Bastogne was relieved and the counterattack gained ground, the direction of the war became clear. The snow eventually melted. The forests of the Ardennes returned to silence. But the consequences of that battle continued shaping events until the final surrender in May 1945. From Encirclement to Escape was not just a dramatic title. It was the story of how resilience, speed, coordination, and determination sealed Germany's fate. Here on History Plus, we explore these turning points not just as dates and maps, but as moments where human decisions under pressure changed the world. If you found this story powerful or learned something new, take a moment to comment below and share your thoughts. Which decision do you think mattered most? The stand at Bastogne or Patton's rapid maneuver? Your opinion matters, and I read the comments carefully. Also, share this video with someone who loves military history or World War II stories. And if you have not already subscribed to History Plus, make sure you do so you do not miss the next deep dive into history's most defining moments. Because sometimes history is decided not by months or years, but by 48 hours.